He was laughed out of the auction hall when he spent his last $73,000 on a rotting whaling station buried in Antarctic ice. A frozen tomb that hadn't seen human life in 47 years. But when he finally broke through the sealed vault beneath the floorboards, what Marcus discovered didn't just silence the mockery, it rewrote history and revealed a $300 million secret that powerful men had killed to protect. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The coffee at Sal's diner had gone cold an hour ago, but Marcus Brennan didn't notice. He sat in the corner booth, the same one he'd claimed every morning for the past 3 months, staring at the auction listing on his phone like it might disappear if he looked away. Outside, the Alaska winter pressed against the windows, turning the world into shades of white and gray. Inside, the diner hummed with the comfortable rhythm of a small town. Truckers arguing over the Seahawks, fishermen swapping lies about the ones that got away, waitresses who knew everyone's order before they sat down. Marcus was 38 but felt older. His hands were scarred from years of marine salvage work, cutting through sunken hulls, wrestling with underwater cables, diving into waters so cold they could stop your heart in minutes. His face carried the weathered look of someone who'd spent more time underwater than in boardrooms. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and his blue eyes had lost some of their brightness after the divorce papers were signed 6 months ago. The phone screen glowed with an image that most people would scroll past without a second thought. A black and white photograph of a whaling station, all rusted metal and collapsing structures, surrounded by ice and desolation. The listing read simply, Historic Antarctic Whaling Station, Grytviken Complex. Complete facility including processing plant, residential quarters, fuel depot, and docking structures. As is condition. Minimum bid $70,000. Serious inquiries only. You're not actually considering that frozen graveyard, are you? The voice belonged to his business partner, Raymond, sliding into the booth across from him. Raymond was 10 years older, gray-bearded, and had the kind of practical wisdom that came from watching too many dreamers go broke chasing ghosts. Marcus didn't look up. When's the last time you saw a complete whaling station go to auction? Never. Because they're worthless. Raymond grabbed the phone and squinted at the screen. You see this location? It's at the bottom of the world. Marcus. The bottom. You know what it costs just to get there? What it costs to maintain. This thing's been abandoned since 1976 for a reason. 77. Marcus corrected quietly. And there's always a reason things get left behind. Sometimes it's because they're worthless. Sometimes it's because they're waiting for the right person. Raymond set the phone down with a sigh that carried decades of experience. Listen to me. We're barely keeping the business afloat as it is. That job we did last month on the trawler, we're still waiting on payment. You sink 70 grand into some ice-covered pipe dream, and we're done. Not struggling. Done. Marcus finally looked up, and something in his expression made Raymond pause. It wasn't stubbornness or defiance. It was something quieter, something that looked almost like faith. My grandfather was a whaler, Marcus said softly. Worked the Antarctic waters in the 50s and 60s. He used to tell me stories about these places, how they were cities. Really. Complete societies built on ice. Processing plants that could handle a whale in hours. Machine shops that could repair anything. Living quarters for hundreds of men. He said they were miracles of engineering that the world forgot about. And that's exactly what they are. Raymond countered. Forgotten. past tense. Let them stay that way. But Marcus's mind was already made up. That evening, he sat at the small kitchen table in his rental apartment, the place he'd moved into after Jennifer kept the house, and filled out the online bidding form. The auction was in 3 days. He had exactly $73,418 in his business account. It represented everything he'd saved from 15 years of dangerous, back-breaking work. His son Tyler's college fund sat untouched in a separate account that was sacred ground. Something even desperation couldn't make him touch. He hesitated for just a moment, his finger hovering over the submit button. Then he thought about his grandfather's weathered hands drawing maps in the air, describing places where men had carved civilization out of the world's harshest environment. He thought about Tyler, now 17, and barely speaking to him since the divorce, spending all his time on his phone, eyes glazed with the particular emptiness of someone who'd stopped believing his father had anything important to teach him. Marcus pressed submit. 3 days later, he stood in a conference room at the Maritime Auction House in Seattle, surrounded by serious-faced men in expensive suits. The auctioneer's voice droned through lot after lot. Salvage rights to a sunken cargo vessel, decommissioned Coast Guard cutters, abandoned oil platforms. Marcus waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. Finally, Lot 47, former Grytviken-class whaling station, Antarctic territory, complete facility, opening bid $70,000. The room went quiet. Someone coughed. Marcus raised his paddle. $70,000 to bidder 118, the auctioneer announced, looking almost surprised. Do I hear 75? Silence. Going once at 70,000. The auctioneer's gavel hand hovered. Going twice. Then, from the back of the room, laughter. Not polite laughter, but the kind that cuts. Marcus turned to see a group of younger salvage operators, the kind who wore designer watches and had corporate backers, looking at him like he'd just volunteered to jump off a bridge. 70,000 for a popsicle factory. One of them called out. Hell, I'll throw in another 20 if you promise to live there. More laughter rippled through the room. Even the auctioneer smiled slightly. Order, please, he said, but without much conviction. Going 3 times at $70,000 to bidder 118. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. Sold. Marcus sat perfectly still as the laughter continued around him. He felt his face flush, hot, despite the air conditioning. But beneath the embarrassment, beneath the sudden fear of what he'd just committed to, was something else. A quiet certainty that everyone else in that room was wrong. He was still clinging to that certainty 2 hours later when he called his son. Hey, Dad. Tyler's voice carried that particular teenage flatness that made every word sound like an obligation. I need to tell you something, Marcus said, standing in the parking garage next to his truck. The Seattle rain hammered the concrete around him. I bought something today. Something big. Okay. Not a question. Not interest. Just acknowledgement that words had been spoken. An old whaling station. Down in Antarctica. I'm going to fly down there. Check it out. See what I've got. Silence on the other end. Then, is this some kind of midlife crisis thing? Marcus closed his eyes. No, Tyler. It's complicated. But I wanted you to know, in case something happens. In case something happens. Now there was an edge in Tyler's voice. Like what? You fall through the ice and die. Is that supposed to make me feel better about you blowing your money on some frozen junkyard? I'm not going to die. I just wanted. You wanted what, Dad? To tell me you're making another stupid decision. Great. Consider me informed. Mom already told me you were cracking up. Tyler, please. But the line had gone dead. Marcus stood in the rain for a long time after that. Phone still pressed to his ear, listening to silence. Around him, the city moved in its endless rhythm. Cars splashing through puddles, people hurrying under umbrellas, the distant cry of seagulls over the harbor. Everyone going somewhere, everyone certain of their direction. He got in his truck and drove back to Alaska. Back to the tiny office where Raymond was waiting with an expression that said, "I told you so," without needing words. "Well?" Raymond asked. "I got it," Marcus said, simply. Raymond let out a long breath and pulled a bottle of whiskey from his desk drawer. He poured 2 glasses without asking, slid one across the desk. "Then we better drink to it," he said, "because in about 6 months, when you're bankrupt and frozen solid at the bottom of the world, I want to remember this moment. The moment I tried to save you from yourself." They drank in silence. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn. The kind that reminded Marcus he was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than the dull ache of disappointment that had colored the past 2 years. "When do you leave?" Raymond asked finally. "Week after next. Need to arrange transport. Supplies. Hire a boat crew willing to make the run. You know what you're looking for down there." Marcus shook his head. "Not really. Grandfather's stories. Mostly. He said these places were built to last. Said there were wonders buried in them, if you knew where to look." "Wonders," Raymond repeated. Like the word tasted bad. "Let me tell you what you're going to find. Rusted equipment, collapsed buildings, leaking fuel drums, and enough asbestos and toxic waste to qualify as a Superfund site. You're going to spend a year and another $100,000 just making it safe enough to sell for scrap. And even then, good luck finding a buyer for scrap metal at the ass end of the world." Marcus didn't argue. He couldn't, because Raymond was probably right. But something his grandfather had said years ago, on one of their last fishing trips before the old man died, kept echoing in his head. "Sometimes, Marcus, the world hides its best treasures in the places people are too scared or too practical to look. That's not accident. That's protection." 2 weeks later, Marcus stood on the deck of the Southern Cross, a Russian-built icebreaker he'd chartered for an eye-watering $30,000. The captain was a weathered Norwegian named Sven, who'd spent 40 years navigating Antarctic waters and had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen things he wasn't interested in discussing. "You sure about this?" Sven asked, not for the first time, as they approached the coordinates. The water around them was a deep, almost black blue, dotted with ice floes that glowed an impossible white against the darkness. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and ancient. "No," Marcus admitted. "But I'm doing it anyway." Sven grunted something that might have been approval. "That's the only way to do anything worth doing down here. Certainty gets you nowhere. Conviction, though, that'll carry you through hell." The whaling station appeared through the mist like something from another world. Marcus had seen the photographs, had studied the satellite imagery, but nothing prepared him for the reality of it. The structures rose from the rocky shore like the bones of some massive creature. Towering metal frameworks, collapsed roofs, shattered windows, reflecting the weak Antarctic sun. Rust covered everything in varying shades of orange and brown, creating abstract patterns that almost looked intentional, like some avant-garde art installation. The processing plant stood at the center, a 4-story building that would have been impressive even in its prime. Now it leaned slightly to one side, its metal siding peeled away in places to reveal the skeletal framework beneath. Massive chains hung from rusted pulleys, still positioned to haul whale carcasses from the sea. A row of smaller buildings stretched along the shore, what must have been housing for the workers. Administrative offices, maybe a mess hall. Most had partially collapsed roofs, their walls bowed and buckling under decades of Antarctic weather. Jesus, Marcus breathed. Yeah, Sven agreed. That's about right. You really bought this? I really bought this. They anchored offshore, and Marcus loaded into the small inflatable boat with 2 of Sven's crew members. The water was so cold he could feel it through his thermal gear, a penetrating chill that seemed to seep into his bones. Seals watched them from nearby ice floes, their dark eyes curious and unafraid. The only sounds were the motor's purr, the lap of water against the boat, and the occasional crack of ice shifting somewhere in the distance. When they reached the shore, Marcus stepped onto land that probably hadn't felt human weight in decades. His boots crunched on gravel mixed with ice. The air smelled of salt, rust, and something else, something ancient and preserved, like opening a tomb. He walked slowly toward the main building, each step deliberate. Up close, the scale was staggering. The processing plant's main doors had long since fallen off their hinges, leaving a gaping entrance that exhaled cold, stale air. Inside, machinery loomed in the shadows. Massive blades for flensing, steam boilers the size of cars, conveyor systems that had once moved tons of whale meat and bone. Marcus pulled out his flashlight and played it across the interior. Decades of ice and corrosion had fused everything into strange new forms. Water had frozen mid-drip, creating columns of ice that connected ceiling to floor. Metal that should have been sharp-edged had been worn smooth by time and weather. Graffiti, in multiple languages, covered some walls, names and dates, from the last crew to abandon the place, final testaments to their presence. He spent hours exploring, making notes on his waterproof tablet, taking photos and videos. Every building told the same story. Magnificent engineering left to rot, history being slowly consumed by the elements. But what struck him most was how complete everything still was. In most abandoned places, scavengers took anything valuable. Here, isolation had protected everything. The machine shop still had tools hanging on the walls. The mess hall had tables and chairs scattered as if workers had just stepped outside for a smoke. Someone's jacket still hung from a hook near what must have been the medical station. Frozen solid, arms stretched out like a ghost, reaching for something it would never grasp. As the weak Antarctic sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the ice in shades of gold and pink, Marcus stood at the highest point of the complex, looking out over his purchase. Behind him, Sven and the crew were preparing to return to the ship for the night. "You coming?" one of the crewmen called. Marcus turned, ready to say yes, when something caught his eye. Near the edge of the complex, partially hidden by a collapsed storage building, was another structure. Smaller, reinforced with extra metal plating, and unlike everything else, its door was still sealed shut, not just closed sealed. Heavy bolts and what looked like a padlock mechanism secured it. And around the door frame, faded but still visible, were warning signs in 3 languages: English, Norwegian, and Russian. Authorized personnel only. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. That feeling divers get when they see something unexpected on a wreck. A sealed cabin, an unopened container, a mystery waiting to be revealed. 5 more minutes. He called back to the crew. He moved toward the sealed door, his boots slipping slightly on the ice-covered ground. As he got closer, he could make out more details. The door was reinforced steel, not the regular sheet metal used elsewhere. The lock mechanism was military-grade, the kind designed to withstand weather and time. And scratched into the metal, barely visible beneath layers of oxidation, were words in English. Emergency storage. Do not open without authorization. Property of Royal Antarctic Expedition. 1913 to 1977. 1913 to 1977. 64 years of whatever was inside staying sealed. Marcus ran his gloved hand over the markings, his mind racing. What kind of emergency storage stayed locked for 64 years? What did a whaling station need that required military-grade security? Marcus! Sven's voice carried sharp across the ice. Sun's going down. We need to move. Now. But Marcus couldn't tear his eyes away from the door. Because there, nearly hidden in the gap between the door and frame, was something that made his breath catch. A reflection not of rust or ice, but of something smooth, glass or crystal, catching the fading sunlight and throwing it back in colors that had no business being in this monochrome world. Red. Deep. Brilliant red. Like a ruby catching fire. What the hell are you? Marcus whispered. He reached out, tried the lock mechanism. Frozen, solid, corroded beyond function. It would take tools, time, and heat to open this. But he would open it. Whatever was behind this door, whatever had been sealed away for decades, waiting in the darkness, he would find it. Marcus. Last call. He backed away reluctantly, already making mental notes. Tomorrow, he'd come back with cutting equipment. Tomorrow, he'd see what lay behind the steel. But as he turned to follow the crew back to the boat, he didn't notice the way the fading light caught the door's surface one more time, illuminating another marking he'd missed. High in the corner, nearly worn away by time, were 3 words in Norwegian. Bevare for framtiden, keep for the future. The inflatable boat cut through the frigid water, heading back toward the Southern Cross. Marcus sat in the bow, his thermal gear soaked with spray, but he didn't feel the cold. His mind was racing with possibilities. That flash of red behind the door, the warning signs in multiple languages, the dates spanning 64 years. The military-grade lock on what was supposed to be just an old whaling station. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. These places were more than they seemed. Marcus. The world forgot them too easily, too completely. What if he'd been trying to tell Marcus something? What if the stories about whaling stations being complete cities, about wonders hidden in them, weren't just romantic tales from an old man's past? What if there was truth buried beneath the nostalgia? The crew helped him aboard the Southern Cross, and Marcus stood at the railing, staring back at the whaling station as darkness began to fall. The structures were silhouetted against the deepening blue sky, looking even more like the skeleton of some ancient beast. But now, instead of seeing only decay and worthlessness, Marcus saw possibility. That sealed door was hiding something. Something important enough to protect for over a century. Something that caught the light and threw back colors that didn't belong in this frozen wasteland. In the galley, warming his hands around a mug of coffee, Marcus pulled out his tablet, and began researching Royal Antarctic Expedition 1913. Emergency storage. The internet connection was spotty this far south, but he managed to pull up fragments of information. There had been dozens of Antarctic expeditions in the early 20th century. The race to map the continent, to reach the South Pole, to claim territory and resources. Some expeditions were well documented: Shackleton, Scott, Amundsen. Others were private ventures, funded by wealthy individuals or corporations looking for commercial opportunities. But one name kept appearing in the maritime records: Captain Robert Talbot, British naval officer, led a privately funded expedition in 1912 that was supposed to survey mineral deposits along the Antarctic coast. The ship was called Endurance, not Shackleton's famous vessel, but another ship with the same name. According to the limited records Marcus could find, Talbot's Endurance had departed from Grytviken in March of 1913 and was never seen again, presumed lost with all hands somewhere in the Weddell Sea. But if the ship was lost, what was the expedition's property doing sealed in a whaling station vault? And why had someone maintained it until 1977, 64 years after the expedition disappeared? Marcus made notes, saved screenshots, bookmarked every reference he could find. Tomorrow, he'd return with cutting equipment and open that door. Tonight, he needed to understand what he might be walking into. Sven appeared in the galley doorway, holding 2 steaming bowls of stew. "Can't sleep either?" Marcus shook his head. "That sealed building. You see much like that when you've been down here?" Sven set down the bowls and pulled up a chair. "Been coming to these waters for 40 years. I've seen stranger things than a locked door. But I've also learned that some locks are meant to stay closed." "That doesn't sound like practical advice." "No," Sven agreed. "But neither is buying an abandoned whaling station." He ate a spoonful of stew. "These old places, they have layers, like ice cores. You drill down, you find history, sometimes treasure, sometimes just old bones and bad memories. The question is always the same. What's the cost of digging? Everything has a cost. True. But some prices are higher than money." Sven's eyes met Marcus's. "I've been doing this long enough to recognize a man on a mission. You're not here to sell scrap metal, are you?" Marcus hesitated, then shook his head. "My grandfather used to say these stations were more than they seemed, that the world forgot them too easily, too completely. Like something wanted them forgotten. Maybe something did." Sven finished his stew. "Well, you paid your money. Whatever's behind that door is yours by right. Just remember that rights and wisdom don't always shake hands." Marcus spent that night in his cramped cabin, unable to sleep, planning his approach to the sealed door. He'd brought cutting equipment, plasma torch, reciprocating saw, pry bars specifically for dealing with locked spaces. But something about this felt different. This wasn't just cutting open a rusted hatch on a sunken ship. This was opening something that had been deliberately sealed, deliberately protected, for longer than he'd been alive. By the time weak dawn light began filtering through his porthole, he'd made his decision. Careful approach, document everything, respect what he found. Whatever was behind that door had been waiting over a century. It deserved to be revealed properly. At 0700 hours, he was back on shore with the same 2 crew members from yesterday. They hauled equipment up to the sealed building in silence, the only sounds their breathing and the crunch of boots on ice. The Antarctic morning was eerily beautiful, the sky a pale blue that seemed to go on forever, the ice fields gleaming like cut crystal, the distant crack and groan of glaciers carving into the sea. Marcus set up 2 high-powered LED arrays, flooding the sealed door with light. In the harsh glare, he could see details he'd missed yesterday. The door wasn't just reinforced, it was insulated. Thick rubber gaskets, now cracked and peeling, had once created an airtight seal. The lock mechanism was German-made, pre-war manufacturing, the kind used for bank vaults and ammunition stores. Whatever's inside, someone wanted it preserved, one of the crew members observed. This setup would maintain internal temperature and humidity. Very expensive for 1913. Marcus nodded. He pulled out the plasma torch, checked the gas levels, then looked at his 2 helpers. Once I cut this open, there's no going back. Last chance to walk away. Neither moved. All right then. Marcus ignited the torch, the blue flame hissing to life. Let's see what's been waiting. The cutting took 3 hours. The door was 3 inches of solid steel, far more than necessary for simple storage. Marcus worked carefully, methodically, cutting a rectangular section large enough to step through. The metal glowed orange, then white, dripping molten beads that hissed and froze on the ice below. Sweat dripped down his face despite the sub-zero temperature, his arms aching from holding the torch steady. When the final cut completed, one of the crew members used a pry bar to push the section inward. It fell with a hollow boom that echoed across the complex, reverberating off the abandoned buildings like a church bell announcing something sacred. Cold air rushed out, carrying a smell that made Marcus pause. Dry, sterile, preserved. Not the musty rot of abandonment, but the clean emptiness of a laboratory sealed in time. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and stepped through. The room beyond was larger than he'd expected, maybe 30 feet by 30 feet, with a ceiling 10 feet high. But it wasn't the size that stole his breath. It was the order. Metal shelving units, military surplus style, lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling. Each shelf held wooden crates, all identical in size and construction, all marked with serial numbers and dates. In the center of the room stood a steel table with what looked like a laboratory setup. Glass beakers still arranged in perfect rows, brass scales gleaming dully in his flashlight beam, measurement tools laid out with surgical precision. And against the far wall, visible even in the dim light, was what had caught the sunlight yesterday. Glass display cases, each one containing specimens mounted on velvet backgrounds that had somehow maintained their deep blue color after a century. Marcus moved to the nearest shelf and carefully pulled down a crate. The wood was dry but solid, still strong despite its age. He set it on the table and slowly pried open the lid, the nails groaning in protest. Inside, packed in sawdust and cloth wrappings, were rocks, but not ordinary rocks. Each specimen was individually wrapped, labeled with handwritten tags in precise scientific notation, location coordinates, date collected, geological classification, estimated value. Marcus picked up one the size of his fist. In the LED light, it sparkled with embedded crystals, clear, brilliant facets that caught and fractured the illumination into rainbow shards that danced across the walls. "Holy God," one of the crew members whispered. "That's beryl. High-grade beryl crystal." Marcus turned to look at her. Maria had mentioned she'd worked at research stations before joining Sven's crew, but he hadn't realized she had geological training. "How much is something like this worth?" he asked. Maria moved closer, examining the specimen carefully. In today's market, maybe $3,000 per kilogram for raw crystal like this. She picked up another piece, her eyes widening. "This one's even better quality. Could be double that." Marcus looked down at the crate. "How many kilograms are in here?" Maria did quick mental math. 20, maybe 25 kilograms. That's one crate worth potentially $150,000. They both turned slowly to look at the shelves. Marcus counted quickly. 15 shelves per wall, 3 walls, 10 crates per shelf, 450 crates total. That's impossible, Marcus heard himself say. That would be $67 million, Maria finished quietly. Just in the crates, not counting whatever's in those display cases. The third crew member, Anton, had moved to the display cases against the far wall. His voice came out strangled. Marcus, you need to see this. Marcus walked over on legs that felt disconnected from his body. The first display case held what looked like quartz formations, but the crystals were too perfect, too pure, each one the size of his thumb and completely transparent. The second case contained rose-colored stones that gleamed with an internal fire even in the flashlight beam. But it was the third case that made Marcus's hands start to shake. Diamonds. Not industrial diamonds or small chips, but proper gemstones. Dozens of them, ranging from pebble size to one in the center that was easily 50 carats. They lay on midnight blue velvet like stars against a night sky. Each one cut and polished by nature into geometric perfection. This isn't possible, Marcus said. Antarctica doesn't have diamond deposits. The geology's all wrong. Maybe not Antarctica, Maria said quietly. She was reading a placard mounted on the wall beside the cases. But Australia does. South Africa does. India does. She looked up, her face pale in the LED light. These aren't from Antarctica. They're from expedition stops on the way here. Look at the dates. Marcus joined her, reading the cramped handwriting on the yellowed placard. Emergency Specimen Collection. Royal Geographic Antarctic Expedition. 1911 to 1913. Primary Expedition. Captain Robert Talbot. Geological Survey Team. Dr. Heinrich Strauss. Dr. James Patterson. Commission. Private survey of mineral deposits along South Atlantic and Antarctic routes. Specimens secured under emergency provisions due to expedition loss. Maintained by agreement with Crown and Norwegian Whaling Authority. Contents to remain sealed pending resolution of legal ownership. Last maintenance. March 1977. Expedition loss. Maria repeated softly. The ship went down. Marcus's mind was racing now, pieces clicking together like a complex mechanism, finally engaging. An expedition funded privately, probably by investors, hoping to open new mining territories. They'd collected valuable mineral specimens from multiple locations. Diamonds from Africa, emeralds from South America, maybe gold samples from Australia. Samples that would prove the viability of future mining operations. But they never made it home. The ship sank, or the crew died, or both. And someone, probably the survivors or the next expedition to reach this whaling station, had transferred the most valuable specimens here for safekeeping. Then the whaling industry collapsed. The station was abandoned, but the specimens remained, sealed in their vault, protected by isolation and a lock no one dared cut. Waiting, how much? Anton asked simply. How much is all this worth? Marcus didn't answer right away. He was methodically opening more crates now, documenting what he found with his camera. Raw emeralds the size of walnuts, sapphires that glowed like captured sky, rubies that looked like drops of frozen blood. Gold samples with visible veins running through quartz matrix. Platinum, silver, rare earth minerals he'd need an expert to identify. Historical artifacts, sextants made of brass and ivory, hand-drawn maps on vellum, journals wrapped in oilcloth, all perfectly preserved in the dry, cold air. Each crate held not just monetary value but historical significance, proof of early Antarctic exploration, geological data that might rewrite understanding of Southern Hemisphere mineral deposits. Conservatively, Marcus finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, if we're talking raw material value, not historical value, maybe 80 to 100 million. But if we factor in the historical aspect, if these are authenticated properly, if collectors and museums get involved, he met Maria's eyes. 300 million, maybe more. The silence that followed was so profound Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. $300 million. Enough to change lives. Enough to change everything. Enough to make powerful people do terrible things, to claim it. Then Maria stiffened, her head turning sharply toward the entrance. Did you hear that? Marcus went still, listening. At first, nothing. Then faint but distinct, the sound of an engine. Multiple engines. Growing closer. Anton moved to the entrance and looked out through the gap they'd cut. Helicopter, he said flatly. Big one. Military style. Coming fast. That's impossible, Marcus said. But he was already moving toward the entrance. We're in the middle of nowhere. The nearest research station is 500 kilometers away. Well, someone found us. Anton's hand moved unconsciously to the knife on his belt. And I don't think they're friendly tourists. Marcus peered out at the sky. There, against the pale blue morning, was a black shape growing larger by the second. Not one helicopter, two. Both headed directly for the whaling station. Their rotors, cutting the air with a rhythmic thump that seemed to shake the ground. His radio crackled to life. Sven's voice, tight with urgency. Marcus, we've got company. 2 helicopters, private registration, just appeared on radar. They're hailing us, demanding to know what we're doing here. I told them scientific survey, but they're not buying it. They're asking specifically about you. What the hell is going on? Marcus's mind raced through the possibilities. How could anyone know he was here? He'd told Raymond, Tyler, and Jennifer. The auction house knew. But that was it. Unless, he thought back to the auction. Those young salvage operators, laughing at him. One of them had money. Real money. The kind that could charter helicopters and bribe officials. And if they'd researched this property after the auction, if they'd found the same historical references Marcus had ignored until yesterday, if they'd put the pieces together faster than he had. They know, Marcus said quietly into the radio. Someone figured it out. Figured out what? Sven demanded. But Marcus was already running back into the sealed building. Behind him, Maria had grabbed one of the diamond cases. Anton was securing his pack with quick, efficient movements. We need to get this stuff to the boat, Marcus said. Now. As much as we can carry. And then what? Maria asked, her voice rising slightly. There are 2 helicopter loads of whoever they are landing in about 90 seconds. We're outnumbered and outgunned. Marcus looked at the shelves of crates, at the centuries' worth of treasure they represented. Then he looked at the diamonds in Maria's arms, easily $50 million worth. Enough to prove what was here. Enough to establish legal claim. Enough to fight for the rest. We take what we can carry, Marcus said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Document the rest. And we call for help before they do. The helicopters were landing now, their rotors throwing up massive clouds of snow and ice that turned the world white. Through the whiteout, Marcus could see figures emerging, men in cold weather gear, moving with the kind of precision that suggested military training. Anton grabbed his arm. "These aren't salvage operators, Marcus. These are security contractors. Someone brought serious firepower to what they thought would be an easy grab. Then we better move fast." Marcus pulled out his phone, activated the camera, and started filming everything. The shelves, the crates, the labels, the display cases. Every second of footage was evidence, proof of what he'd found first. "Maria, grab as many small, high-value specimens as you can fit. Anton, help me with this case." "Exit to where?" Anton demanded. "There's one beach. They're landing between us and the boat." Marcus looked around the room with new eyes, remembering his grandfather's stories. These old whaling stations, they were complete little cities. Everything that implied, including ways to move between buildings when the weather was too harsh to go outside. "The fuel depot," he said suddenly. These places had underground fuel storage, massive tanks, and tunnels connecting them so they could move supplies, even in blizzards. Anton's eyes widened. "You think the tunnels still exist?" "Only one way to find out." Marcus grabbed a sledgehammer from his equipment pile and ran to the back wall of the sealed room. He swung hard, and the ancient wood paneling cracked like ice under pressure. 3 more swings and a section fell away, revealing rough-cut rock behind it. And there, mostly hidden by decades of ice buildup, was exactly what he'd prayed for. A dark opening, man-made, leading down into the earth. "Go!" Marcus shouted. Maria ducked into the tunnel, the diamond case clutched to her chest. Anton followed, his flashlight illuminating walls of stone and frozen mineral deposits that glittered like buried treasure. Marcus took one last look at the room, 450 crates of geological specimens, a fortune in rare minerals, proof of a lost expedition, all of it now at risk of being stolen by whoever was landing those helicopters. He grabbed a leather-bound journal from the table thin enough to carry, valuable enough to prove his claim, and one more crate, smaller than the others, marked "Primary Samples, Talbot Collection." Then he followed his crew into the darkness. Behind them, he could hear shouts, the crunch of boots on ice, the sound of men entering the sealed building. They'd found the cut door. They knew someone had been here. Marcus pulled a chemical glow stick from his pack, cracked it to life, and tossed it back toward the entrance as he descended into the tunnel. Let them see the light. Let them know someone had been here first. Let them understand that whatever they'd come to steal was already spoken for. The tunnel was barely 5 feet high, forcing them to crouch and shuffle forward. Ice had formed on the walls in fantastic shapes, curtains and columns, and frozen waterfalls where condensation had built up over decades. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhalation like swallowing knives. Marcus could see his breath forming clouds in the LED light from Anton's flashlight, illuminating particles of ice suspended in the still air. "These tunnels stable?" Maria asked, her voice echoing off stone. "They were 100 years ago," Marcus replied, which wasn't exactly reassuring. They moved as quickly as the cramped space allowed, following the tunnel as it twisted through the rock foundation of the whaling station. Every 20 feet or so, they passed rusted pipes and ancient electrical conduits, the infrastructure that had once kept this place running. Some sections had partially collapsed, forcing them to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for their bodies. The crate Marcus carried scraped against the stone, and he sent up a silent prayer that he wasn't damaging whatever priceless specimens were inside. Behind them, faintly, they could hear more shouts, Their pursuers had found the tunnel entrance. "Move faster," Anton urged, but there was nowhere to go faster. The tunnel was what it was: narrow, dark, unforgiving. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, Anton's light caught something ahead. Wooden supports, a ladder leading up, and blessed relief, an exit hatch. They emerged into another building, this one more collapsed than most. The roof had caved in years ago, letting in shafts of pale Antarctic sunlight that made the ice sparkle like scattered diamonds. Marcus got his bearings. They were on the far side of the complex, near what had been the rendering plant. Between them and the shore, where Sven's boat waited, was roughly 300 yards of open ground. "We'll never make it unseen," Maria said quietly, reading his thoughts. She was right. The helicopters had landed near the main processing plant, and Marcus could see figures moving between buildings, searching with tactical efficiency. These weren't casual explorers. They moved like professionals, with clear communication and coordinated spacing. Someone had sent a small army to claim this place. "The rendering plant," Marcus said. "If we can get to its far side, there's a depression in the terrain, a drainage channel from the old operations. It runs almost straight to the beach. We stay low. We might make it." "Might is a terrible word," Anton observed. But he was already moving, his bulk somehow melding with the shadows. They crept through the collapsed building, using the rubble as cover. The diamond case Maria carried kept catching light in unfortunate ways, so Anton wrapped it in his jacket. Marcus clutched his crate and the leather journal, his eyes constantly scanning for movement. They were halfway to the rendering plant when a voice called out in English, amplified through a bullhorn. "Marcus Brennan, we know you're here. We know what you found. There's no need for this to be difficult." Marcus froze behind a collapsed wall section. Beside him, Maria's eyes were wide with fear. The voice continued, carrying across the ice with crystalline clarity. "You bought this facility legally. We respect that. But what you found predates your purchase. It belongs to the heirs of the royal expedition, and we represent those interests. Come out peacefully. We can negotiate fair compensation." "Fair compensation," Anton muttered under his breath. "That's what they call it before they make you disappear. You don't know that," Maria whispered. "Yes, I do." Anton's voice was flat, certain. "I worked security for mining operations in Siberia before I came south. I know exactly what fair compensation means in situations like this." Marcus's mind raced through scenarios. They had maybe one case of diamonds and one crate of mineral samples. Valuable, yes, but not even a fraction of what remained in the sealed vault. If he gave up now, negotiated, maybe he'd walk away with something. Maybe they'd let him keep a finder's fee. But even as he thought it, he knew it was fantasy. These people, whoever they were, hadn't chartered 2 helicopters and brought security contractors to Antarctica to negotiate. They'd come to take. And anyone who knew what was really here, anyone who could testify to the true extent of the find, would become a liability. "We run," Marcus decided. "On 3. Make for the rendering plant, then the drainage channel. Don't stop for anything." "What about Sven and the boat?" Maria asked urgently. "I'll radio him as soon as we're clear. Tell him to pull anchor and meet us at the south beach, far side of the point. It's farther, but there's no way these helicopters can land there too rocky." "And if they have boats?" Anton asked. "Then we improvise." Marcus adjusted his grip on the crate, his knuckles white beneath his gloves. 1, 2, 3. They burst from cover and sprinted for the rendering plant. Behind them, shouts erupted immediately. Marcus heard the crack of what might have been a warning shot, or might not have been a warning at all. He didn't look back, didn't slow down. The distance to the rendering plant felt like miles instead of yards. Marcus's boots slipped on ice, his lungs burned with cold air, and the crate seemed to gain weight with every step. Beside him, Maria ran with surprising grace despite the burden she carried. The wrapped diamond case clutched to her chest like a child she was protecting. Anton brought up the rear, his bulk moving faster than should be possible for a man his size. They crashed through the doorway of the rendering plant just as another shot rang out. This one wasn't a warning, it chewed splinters from the doorframe inches above Marcus's head, sending fragments of frozen wood spinning through the air. Not negotiating, Anton panted as they stumbled deeper into the building. "Told you!" Inside the rendering plant was a maze of rusted machinery and collapsed catwalks, a three-dimensional puzzle of metal and shadow. They wove through the wreckage, heading for the far side, where the drainage channel began. Behind them, Marcus could hear their pursuers entering the building, moving more cautiously now that they were in the maze, their boots ringing on metal flooring. "This way," Marcus hissed, ducking under a collapsed beam. The drainage channel was visible now, a concrete-lined trench about 4 feet deep that had once carried waste and blood away from the rendering operations. Now it was filled with snow and ice, but it provided cover from the helicopters overhead and a direct line to the beach. They dropped into the channel and started moving, hunched over, slipping and sliding on the ice. Marcus pulled out his radio with his free hand, nearly dropping it in his haste. "Sven, you copy?" "Static." "Then, Marcus, where the hell are you? These guys are threatening to board us. Don't let them. Pull anchor now. Meet us at South Beach, far side of the point, and radio for help. Coast Guard, Navy, anyone with jurisdiction. Tell them we've discovered historical artifacts worth hundreds of millions, and we're under assault by armed parties trying to steal them." "You've discovered what?" Even through the static, Sven's shock was palpable. "No time. Go, now." Marcus shoved the radio back in his pocket and focused on not breaking his ankle in the uneven channel. Behind them, shouts indicated their pursuers had reached the drainage channel and were following, their boots hammering on concrete. The channel ran for maybe 200 yards before emptying onto a rocky beach on the station's south side. As they emerged, Marcus looked back and saw 4 men dressed in black tactical gear, carrying rifles, moving with the kind of efficiency that spoke of military training. Not security guards, professional contractors. The kind you hired when you wanted problems permanently solved. "The beach is too exposed," Maria said, breathing hard. "They'll pick us off before we reach the water." She was right. The South Beach was a strip of black volcanic rock about 50 yards wide, with the ocean on one side and steep cliffs on the other. No cover, nowhere to hide. And in the distance, Marcus could see Sven's inflatable cutting through the ice floes, the crewman at the outboard motor pushing it to maximum speed, heading straight for them. "We run for the water," Marcus shouted over the wind. "They won't shoot if it means we take the evidence into the ocean with us." "You sure about that?" Anton asked. But he was already running. They burst from the drainage channel and sprinted across the exposed beach. Marcus heard a shout behind them, then the distinctive snap of rifle fire. But Anton had been right about one thing, whoever they were. They weren't shooting to kill. Not yet. Not when their targets were carrying millions of dollars worth of irreplaceable specimens. What happens next will turn this frozen wasteland into a battleground, reveal a truth that powerful men thought they'd buried forever, and remind us why sometimes the most valuable treasures are worth fighting for. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The inflatable was 30 yards from shore. 20. The water here was painfully cold. Marcus knew from experience that you had maybe 5 minutes before hypothermia made your muscles useless, before the cold reached your core and started shutting down vital functions. They'd have to time this perfectly. On my mark, he gasped as they reached the water's edge. We throw the containers to the boat, then swim for it. They can't risk damaging what we're carrying. This is insane, Maria said, positioning herself at the water's edge. But her face was set with determination. Now! Marcus hurled his crate toward the inflatable with every ounce of strength he had left. The crewman caught it cleanly, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Maria threw the wrapped diamond case. It hit the side of the boat and almost bounced back into the water, but the crewman lunged and grabbed it at the last second. Behind them, their pursuers had reached the beach. Marcus heard a harsh voice shouting, "Shoulder arms! Do not let them reach that boat. Go!" Marcus shoved Maria forward. She hit the water and gasped as the cold struck her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Anton dove in next, his bulk creating a massive splash that soaked them all. Marcus followed, and the water hit him like he'd been struck by lightning. It wasn't just cold, it was the absence of everything. The absence of warmth, of sensation, of thought, beyond the primal need to get out before it killed him. He swam with everything he had, his arms and legs already starting to feel wooden, his movements becoming sluggish. The inflatable was 10 yards away. 5. Hands reached down from above Anton's massive fist, closing around Marcus's collar, hauling him up like he weighed nothing at all. They collapsed in the bottom of the boat, shivering so violently their teeth clattered like dice in a cup. The crewman gunned the engine, and they pulled away from shore, the inflatable bouncing over small waves. Behind them, the 4 contractors stood at the water's edge, rifles lowered, impotent fury clear in their body language even from this distance. "You'll regret this, Brennan," one of them shouted across the water, his voice carrying clearly in the still Antarctic air. "We know where you live. We know about your son." The words cut through Marcus's hypothermic fog like a knife. They knew about Tyler. They'd researched him, investigated him, gathered information about his family, and that meant this wasn't over. "Get us to the ship," he managed through chattering teeth, his jaw muscles cramping with cold. "We need to get out of Antarctic waters, now, before they can organize, before they can call in more resources, before this gets worse." As the inflatable fought through the ice floes toward the Southern Cross, Marcus looked back at the whaling station one last time. The 2 helicopters sat like black insects on the ice. The contractors were regrouping, probably planning their next move. And somewhere in that sealed vault, $300 million worth of treasure waited, unprotected, except for Marcus's legal ownership, and the hope that the law would mean something when powerful people decided they wanted what was his. He clutched the leather journal to his chest, feeling its waterproof covering crackle under his frozen fingers. Inside were the expedition notes, the maps, the proof of what he'd found. And tucked in his waistband, wrapped in plastic, was his grandfather's compass, the one the old man had carried through his own Antarctic journeys decades ago. "I found it, Grandpa," Marcus whispered through blue lips. "I found the treasure, just like you said. But now I need to figure out how to keep it, how to protect it, how to make sure Tyler stays safe while I fight for what's mine." Beside him, Maria and Anton were starting to warm up, their shivering becoming less violent. The crewman was radioing ahead to Sven, explaining the situation in rapid-fire Norwegian. And somewhere behind them, in the cold waters south of everything, a fortune waited to see if its new owner had the strength to claim it, the courage to defend it, and the wisdom to know that some battles are won not with force, but with persistence, faith, and the refusal to let powerful people steal what righteous work had earned. The Southern Cross loomed ahead, its hull dark against the ice. Home, safety, warmth, but also the beginning of a new kind of battle, one fought in courtrooms and media outlets, and midnight phone calls threatening everything Marcus held dear. He looked down at the crate the crewman had secured in the boat, at the wrapped diamond case, at the journal, such small things to represent such enormous stakes. But sometimes the biggest battles start with the smallest pieces. Sometimes all you need is proof, and faith, and the stubborn refusal to back down when everyone says you should. The Southern Cross's engines rumbled to life as they climbed aboard, dripping and shaking. Sven was already setting course north, pushing the icebreaker to maximum speed, putting distance between them and whatever came next. But Marcus knew in his bones that distance wouldn't be enough. The people who'd sent those helicopters, who'd brought armed contractors to the bottom of the world, who'd threatened his son, they wouldn't stop just because he'd escaped this time. This was just the beginning. The Southern Cross cut through the swells with single-minded determination. Engines pushed to their limits, leaving a churning wake of white water and fractured ice. In the ship's cramped galley, Marcus sat wrapped in thermal blankets, hands still trembling from more than just cold, as he stared at the leather journal spread open on the scarred wooden table. Around him, Sven's crew worked with quiet efficiency, but the tension was palpable. Everyone knew they'd crossed a line. Those men on the beach weren't going to just let this go. They'd made that abundantly clear when they'd threatened Tyler. "They're following us," Sven announced, entering the galley with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Both helicopters in the air, pacing us at a distance. They can't force us to stop, we're in international waters, but they're making sure we don't disappear." "Can they track us all the way back?" Maria asked. She'd changed into dry clothes but still looked shaken, her usual composure cracked by the rifle shots and the desperate swim. "To wherever we make port." "Absolutely." Sven pulled up a chair across from Marcus. "So here's the question that matters. Where do we go, and what do we do when we get there?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on a page in the journal, reading and rereading words written in precise copperplate handwriting that had somehow survived a century. The 17th of March, 1913. Final entry before departure. The primary collection is secure in the vault beneath Grytviken station, sealed according to Crown protocols. Secondary samples remain with expedition. Should the Endurance fail to return, let it be known that these specimens represent not mere wealth, but proof of the Southern Hemisphere's untapped potential. Captain Talbot has insisted on this precaution, stating that trust, once established, must be honored across generations. The combination to the vault's inner chamber, 187294113. May God speed us home. Dr. Heinrich Strauss, Chief Geologist. Inner chamber. There was more than what Marcus had found. The sealed room was just the outer vault. Somewhere beneath it was another layer, another collection, secured with a combination lock that had been waiting for over a century for someone to discover its secret. Marcus? Sven's voice broke through his thoughts. I need to know the plan. Marcus closed the journal carefully. We're going to need lawyers. Good ones. The kind who can handle international maritime salvage law and historical artifacts. And we're going to need them before we make port anywhere. Lawyers cost money, Sven pointed out. The kind of lawyers who can fight governments and corporations. That's serious money. I know. Marcus looked at the wooden crate sitting in the corner, the one he'd carried from the vault through the tunnel and across the beach. That's why we're going to sell one sample. Just one. Enough to fund the legal fight and secure the rest. Anton, who'd been silent until now, spoke up from where he stood near the porthole, watching their pursuers. Those men on the beach, they mentioned your son. They've done research. These aren't random opportunists. Someone with serious resources is backing them. Marcus felt ice in his stomach that had nothing to do with his recent swim. Tyler. His boy was back in Alaska, probably still angry about their last conversation, with no idea that his father's frozen junkyard might have put a target on both their backs. I need to make a call, Marcus said, pulling out his satellite phone. His hands shook slightly as he dialed Tyler's number, and it wasn't from the cold. It rang 4 times. 5. He was preparing for voicemail when Tyler's voice came through. Wary. Dad? Tyler. Listen to me carefully. Are you at home? I'm at school. Dad. What's good? Stay there. Don't go home alone. Call your mother. Tell her to meet you. Tell her. Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. Tell her there might be people asking questions about me, about what I'm doing down here. Do not talk to them. Do not tell them anything. Do you understand? You're scaring me. Good. You should be scared. I found something, Tyler. Something valuable. And there are people who want to take it from me. People who might try to use you to get to me. Silence on the other end. Then, in a quieter voice, how valuable, potentially life-changing, potentially dangerous, both at once. I thought this was just another one of your wild ideas. Like the time you bought that treasure map at the flea market that turned out to be a photocopied page from a pirate novel. Despite everything, Marcus smiled faintly at the memory. Yeah, well, turns out sometimes the wild ideas pan out. But right now, I need you safe. Please, Tyler. Just for a few days until I can get back and sort this out. Okay, Tyler said after a moment. Okay, Dad. I'll call Mom. Thank you. Marcus's throat felt tight. I love you, son. Love you too. A pause. Dad, whatever you found, it must be pretty special if people are threatening us over it. It is. But you're more special. After the call ended, Marcus sat for a long moment, the phone still in his hand. Sven and the crew had been listening, and their faces reflected his own worry. We need to move fast, Sven said quietly. The longer we're at sea, the more time they have to organize, legal or otherwise. Marcus nodded slowly. Closest port where we can hire the legal help we need. Punta Arenas, Chile. 3 days sail if the weather holds. Then that's where we go. Marcus stood, the thermal blanket falling from his shoulders. And while we're sailing, I need to document everything. Photos, videos, written testimony from all of us. We need a paper trail that proves what we found and when we found it. Over the next 72 hours, the Southern Cross became a floating documentary studio. Marcus filmed everything with meticulous care. The crate's contents raw emeralds worth an estimated $8 million, each stone glowing with internal fire. The diamond case, 53 stones of various sizes, conservatively valued at $42 million, each one a geological miracle. And page after page of the expedition journal, carefully lit and recorded in high definition, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence. Maria, it turned out, had more than just casual geological knowledge. She'd worked on her doctorate in mineralogy before budget cuts had ended her academic career. Now she provided on-camera analysis of each specimen, explaining their geological significance, their origin, their estimated value. Her expertise transformed what might have been dismissed as treasure hunting into legitimate scientific discovery. Anton, despite his gruff exterior, had a surprisingly steady hand with the camera and a good eye for documentation. He'd worked security for enough sketchy operations to know how crucial proper evidence gathering could be. But it was the journal that provided the real story. As Marcus read through it day by day, a picture emerged of an expedition that had started as legitimate scientific research and evolved into something more complex. Captain Robert Talbot, a British naval officer turned explorer, had secured private funding for an Antarctic expedition, ostensibly to map previously uncharted coastline. But his real backers, wealthy industrialists looking for new mineral deposits to exploit, had a different agenda entirely. The Endurance, not Shackleton's famous ship, but another vessel with the same name, had made multiple stops on its journey south: Cape Town, Madagascar, Western Australia, Valparaiso. At each stop, Talbot's geological team collected samples with systematic precision. But these weren't casual collections for scientific curiosity. They were targeted surveys of known mineral-rich regions, gathering specimens that would prove the viability of future mining operations, that would attract investors, that would open new territories to exploitation. By the time they reached Antarctica, they'd accumulated a fortune in geological samples. But then, disaster struck. The journal's later entries grew increasingly tense, describing ice conditions worsening faster than predicted, supplies running lower than planned, disagreements among the crew about whether to turn back or push forward. The final entry, dated the 17th of March 1913, described transferring the most valuable specimens to the vault at Grytviken, to be held in trust until the expedition's return. They never returned. Historical records that Marcus found through the ship's satellite internet confirmed it. The Endurance departed Grytviken on the 20th of March, 1913, and was never seen again. Presumed lost with all hands in the Weddell Sea. Crushed by ice or sunk in a storm, 47 men gone into the silence of the Southern Ocean. But the specimens remained, sealed in their vault, protected by a combination lock and Antarctic isolation. The whaling station's managers knew about them, the journal made that clear. But between wars, economic depression, and the eventual collapse of the whaling industry, the vault had simply waited. Until a salvage operator from Alaska paid $73,000 for a frozen graveyard, and had the audacity to actually show up. On the morning of the third day, land appeared on the horizon. The rocky coast of Chile, with Punta Arenas visible as a cluster of buildings against green hills that looked impossibly vibrant after days of nothing but ice and water. Marcus stood at the bow, watching their approach, when his satellite phone rang. "Unknown number," he answered cautiously. "Hello? Mr. Brennan." The voice was male, cultured, with a slight British accent that suggested expensive education and old money. My name is Edmund Pierce. I represent the Talbot Heritage Foundation. I believe you have something that belongs to us. Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. I have something I bought legally and discovered legally. If you have a claim, you can file it through proper channels. Oh, we will. But I'm calling as a courtesy, to save us both considerable expense and trouble. You see, Mr. Brennan, the Talbot expedition was privately funded. The specimens they collected belong to the descendants of those funders, my clients. Your ownership of the facility doesn't extend to its contents, particularly contents that were explicitly held in trust. That's for a court to decide, perhaps. Pierce's tone remained pleasant, almost friendly, which somehow made it more threatening. But courts take time. And during that time, you'll be fighting not just us, but the Chilean government, the British government, possibly the Norwegian government, all claiming jurisdiction, all tying up those specimens in legal limbo for years. Decades. Potentially. What's your point? My point is this. We're prepared to offer you a finder's fee. $5 million American cash, in exchange for turning over all specimens and documentation you've removed from the site. It's generous compensation for a 3-day adventure. Marcus laughed, short and bitter. You think this is about money? Isn't everything? Not this. Marcus looked out at the approaching harbor, at the civilization he was about to re-enter, at the complexity waiting to swallow him. Your clients or whoever's really behind this had 100 years to claim that site. 100 years to go looking. But they didn't, did they? They let it rot, let it become forgotten. Because it was easier to pretend it didn't exist than to actually do the work to claim it. That's an oversimplification. I don't care. Marcus cut him off, his voice hardening. I did the work. I took the risk. And whatever legal fight you want to bring it. But I'm not handing over a damn thing. Silence. Then, in a colder voice that dropped all pretense of friendliness. That's unfortunate, Mr. Brennan. Truly. I hope you understand that you're making this far more difficult than it needs to be. For everyone. Including your son. The implied threat hung in the air like poison gas. You go near my son, Marcus said quietly, and I'll make sure every media outlet in the world knows that the Talbot Heritage Foundation threatens teenagers to steal historical artifacts. See how that plays with your donors. He ended the call before Pierce could respond. Sven, who'd been standing nearby, shook his head slowly. You just made some very powerful enemies. Yeah, well, I'm getting good at that. Marcus headed for the cabin to gather his things. Let's get to port. Time to find those lawyers. Punta Arenas was a city of contrasts. Modern buildings next to century-old warehouses, fishing boats sharing the harbor with cruise ships, and a mix of languages that reflected its position as a gateway to Antarctica. Marcus, Maria, and Anton disembarked, carrying sealed cases containing the specimens. Moving quickly through customs with Sven's help, the captain had contacts here, people who didn't ask too many questions when maritime salvage was involved. The law firm Sven recommended occupied a renovated colonial building near the city center. Its facade painted in warm yellows and reds that felt alien after days of white and gray. Valdez and Associates specialized in maritime law, with a particular focus on Antarctic claims and international salvage cases. The senior partner, Carmen Valdez, was a woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She listened to Marcus's story without interrupting, occasionally making notes in precise handwriting. When he finished, she leaned back in her leather chair and steepled her fingers. "Mr. Brennan, I'm going to be direct with you. This is possibly the most complex case I've seen in 30 years of practice. You have Antarctic salvage, historical artifacts, multiple international jurisdictions, private trust law, and now criminal intimidation, all tangled together like fishing line in a propeller. Can you untangle it? Perhaps. But it will take time and money. Considerable amounts of both." Marcus opened the wooden crate he'd carried from Antarctica. The emeralds glowed in the office's fluorescent lighting, each stone a captured piece of ancient fire. "Will this cover your retainer?" Carmen's expression didn't change, but Marcus saw her eyes widen fractionally. "That would, yes. That would cover it quite thoroughly." "Good. Because we need to move fast. The people who tried to stop me in Antarctica won't stop just because I'm on land. They'll try legal action, probably file ownership claims in multiple countries. And I need to get back to Alaska to protect my son." "About that." Carmen pulled up a file on her computer, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "I took the liberty of doing some preliminary research while you were in transit. The Talbot Heritage Foundation that contacted you, it's a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, but the money behind it traces back to a consortium of British and Australian mining companies. Old money. Very old. These are families who've been extracting wealth from former colonies for generations, so they do have a claim. They think they do. But here's the interesting part. The original funding agreement for the Talbot expedition included a clause about abandoned assets. After 25 years with no claim filed, the assets would revert to the Crown. That deadline passed in 1938. Then there's a second clause. If the Crown doesn't claim them within 50 years, they become the property of whoever legally controls the location where they're stored. Marcus felt something stir in his chest. Hope, maybe. Or just determination, refusing to die. Which means that as the legal owner of the whaling station, purchased through legitimate auction, you have a solid claim to everything found there. But Carmen held up a hand before Marcus could celebrate. Solid doesn't mean certain. They'll argue about the distinction between the facility and its contents. They'll claim the trust provisions supersede property law. They'll drag this through every court they can access. How long? Optimistically, 2 years. Realistically, 5 to 10. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "I can't wait that long. I can't afford to. They've already threatened my son. What happens when they realize legal won't work fast enough?" Carmen's expression grew grimmer. "Then we involve law enforcement. International law enforcement. These people making threats across international borders. That's serious. FBI. Interpol. Chilean PDI. They all have jurisdiction in different ways." Over the next week, Marcus's life became a blur of legal meetings, depositions, and security arrangements that made his head spin. Carmen worked with frightening efficiency, filing claims in 3 different countries, securing injunctions against the Talbot Heritage Foundation, and arranging for the specimens to be held in a secure facility pending resolution of ownership. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tyler called on day 5. His voice was tight, controlled, carrying an edge Marcus hadn't heard before. "Dad, someone's been following Mom." Marcus went cold, his coffee cup freezing halfway to his lips. "What do you mean following?" "A car. Black SUV. Parked outside the house for the past 2 days. Different people, but always someone watching. Mom called the police. But they said they need proof of actual harassment before they can do anything. Pack a bag, Marcus said immediately, his mind already racing through options. Both of you. I'm arranging for you to fly down here. You'll be safer in Chile, where I can protect you. Dad, I can't just leave school. Yes, you can. You're 17. You can finish the term online. This isn't a discussion, Tyler. These people are serious, and I won't risk your safety or your mother's. There was a long pause. Then, in a quieter voice, what did you find down there that's worth all this? History, Marcus said quietly, and enough money to change our lives. But right now, I'd trade all of it for your safety. So pack. Carmen's sending someone to pick you up tomorrow morning. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Not friends, not social media, nobody. Okay, Tyler said, and for the first time in months, his voice held no resentment, just fear, and maybe understanding. Dad, whatever happens, I get it now. Why you did this. It wasn't just about money. Was it? No. Marcus agreed, his throat tight. It never was. 2 days later, Jennifer and Tyler arrived in Punta Arenas. The reunion was awkward ex-wife, teenage son, and the man who'd upended all their lives again with another wild idea. But Jennifer's first words, after hugging Tyler, were to Marcus. Tell me you know what you're doing. I'm figuring it out as I go, Marcus admitted. But I'm not backing down. Not from this. She studied his face for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You look different. Different? How? Like you finally found whatever you've been searching for. She didn't sound happy about it. Exactly. But there was something like grudging respect in her tone. That night, in the apartment, Carmen had arranged for them a spacious 3-bedroom with a view of the Strait of Magellan. Marcus sat with Tyler on the balcony, overlooking the harbor. The Antarctic wind carried the smell of sea salt and diesel fuel, and in the distance, icebergs drifted past like ghost ships heading north. I read the journal, Tyler said quietly, breaking the silence. The one from the expedition. Miss Valdez showed me a copy. Marcus glanced at him, surprised. And? Those men, Talbot and his crew, they spent 3 years collecting those samples, traveled all over the world. Then they died trying to get home, knowing they'd left behind something valuable, something that mattered. Tyler looked at his father, his young face serious in the fading light. You didn't just find treasure, Dad. You found their legacy, their proof that the journey meant something. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Yeah, I guess I did. So we fight for it, Tyler said simply, with the certainty of youth that hasn't learned to doubt itself. Not because it's worth $300 million, because it's worth remembering. And in that moment, Marcus realized his son had grown up somewhere between the divorce and now, had developed his own sense of what mattered, his own understanding of why some battles were worth fighting, even when the odds seemed impossible. Yeah, Marcus agreed, his voice rough. We fight. The legal battle exploded across 3 continents like a wildfire finding oxygen. The Talbot Heritage Foundation filed in London, claiming hereditary rights. The Chilean government claimed jurisdiction based on proximity to their territorial waters. The Norwegian government argued historical ties to the whaling station through the original leasing agreements. And through it all, Carmen Valdez and her team built Marcus's case piece by piece. Auction records proving legitimate purchase, expedition logs establishing the timeline, historical precedent in maritime salvage law. But 2 months into the fight, something unexpected happened. A small article appeared in National Geographic's online edition. Lost Expeditions Treasure Found in Antarctic Whaling Station. It wasn't comprehensive. Someone had leaked partial information, probably from the Chilean side where too many officials knew too much. But it was enough to spark public interest like a match to kindling. Within days, the story went viral. Number Antarctic treasure trended on social media platforms. Historians weighed in on the expedition's significance. Environmental groups praised the potential for using the wealth to fund Antarctic research. Documentary filmmakers reached out with proposals. And most importantly, the public fell in love with the story of a working-class salvage operator, taking on wealthy corporations and fighting to protect history. The pressure shifted like tectonic plates grinding into new positions. The Talbot Heritage Foundation, accustomed to operating in shadows and back rooms, suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Reporters dug into their funding, their connections, their questionable tactics. The men who'd threatened Marcus in Antarctica, exposed as private military contractors with troubling histories of violence in conflict zones. 3 months after Marcus had cut open that sealed door, Carmen called him into her office with a strange expression on her normally composed face. "We got a call," she said without preamble. "From Pierce, the Talbot Foundation's lawyer, and they want to settle." Marcus felt his heart rate spike, adrenaline flooding his system. Settle how? They're offering to drop all ownership claims in exchange for 2 things. First, credit in all official documentation that the Talbot expedition was responsible for collecting the specimens. Second, a percentage of any museum sales or research grants funded by the discovery. 20%. That's it? No money? Upfront? No money. Just credit and future participation. Carmen leaned forward, her eyes intense. They've realized they can't win legally, and they've lost the public relations battle completely. This way, they preserve the Talbot family legacy without admitting defeat. Marcus thought about it, his mind working through the implications. The specimens weren't going to be sold off to private collectors anyway. He and Carmen had already discussed establishing a trust similar to what the original expedition had intended. The artifacts would go to museums. The monetary value would fund Antarctic research and preservation. The Talbot family getting credit and a share of future proceeds seemed fair. Actually, what about the threats? The intimidation? The men in black SUVs watching my family? Part of the settlement includes a formal apology and an admission that certain security contractors acted beyond their authority. The individuals responsible will face charges. It's not perfect, but it's something. Marcus nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. I want one more thing. I want access to complete the vault exploration. Whatever's in that inner chamber Dr. Strauss wrote about. The combination in the journal opens it. Right? Carmen smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her severe features. That's already part of the settlement. You retain exclusive rights to complete exploration of the site, with documentation and proper preservation protocols. The Chilean government agrees to defer jurisdiction pending final archaeological assessment. Then yes. Marcus extended his hand. Let's settle. The papers were signed in a conference room overlooking the Strait of Magellan. The water gray and restless under gathering clouds. Edmund Pierce was there in person this time, looking considerably less confident than he'd sounded on the phone months ago. He shook Marcus's hand with visible reluctance. For what it's worth, Pierce said quietly, his cultured accent somehow deflated. Robert Talbot would have approved of you. He believed treasures belonged to those willing to brave the elements to claim them. Then we have something in common, Marcus replied evenly. That evening, Marcus gathered Tyler and Jennifer in the apartment's living room. The legal documents were spread across the coffee table like maps to a new territory. It's done, he said simply. The settlement's signed. The specimens are officially mine, ours to do with, as we see fit. So now what? Jennifer asked. You sell them? Retire rich? Marcus shook his head. No. Now we honor what Talbot intended. He pulled out the journal, opened it to a page he'd marked. Tyler read this part. Tyler took the journal carefully and read aloud. These specimens must not enrich individuals at the expense of knowledge. Should they be recovered, let them serve the advancement of science and the preservation of the territories from which they came. This is our wish, that our sacrifice serve future generations. The room fell silent. Then Jennifer spoke, her voice softer. So you're giving it away? Not giving it away, Marcus corrected gently. Establishing a trust. The specimens will be catalogued, studied, and displayed in museums. The proceeds will fund Antarctic research and preservation. We'll take enough to cover expenses. Legal fees. Maybe set aside something for Tyler's education. But the rest serves the purpose Talbot died for. Tyler looked up from the journal, his eyes bright. That's actually really cool, Dad. Yeah? Marcus smiled. Think you might want to help administer it? Couple years from now, after college, someone needs to make sure the money goes where it's supposed to. Really? Tyler's face lit up in a way Marcus hadn't seen in years. You'd trust me with that? Who else? You're the one who reminded me why this matters. Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. Besides, you're going to need something impressive on your college applications. They all laughed. And for the first time since the divorce, it felt like they might actually be okay. Different than before, but maybe better in some ways. 6 weeks later, Marcus returned to Antarctica. This time, he came with an international team. Archaeologists from 3 countries, geologists from 5 universities, historians from museums around the world, and a full camera crew filming a documentary. The helicopters that descended on the whaling station now bore UN and Chilean flags instead of corporate insignias. The men who emerged carried specimen cases and documentation equipment, not rifles. Tyler came with him, having convinced his mother that missing a few more weeks of school was worth witnessing history firsthand. He stood beside Marcus as they approached the sealed building, now properly secured and reinforced by the Chilean archaeological team. You nervous? Tyler asked. Terrified, Marcus admitted. What if the inner chamber is empty? What if Dr. Strauss was wrong? What if we've built this up in our minds and there's nothing there but disappointment? Then we've still got the outer vault specimens. That's still incredible. Yeah. But, Marcus trailed off. But you want the full story, Tyler finished. You want to know what Talbot thought was important enough to hide twice. They entered the sealed room, now illuminated by professional lighting arrays that banished every shadow. The documentary crew set up cameras, while the archaeological team carefully documented everything. Carmen Valdez was there too, along with representatives from the Chilean government and the Norwegian Historical Society. Marcus approached the back wall, where he'd discovered the tunnel months ago. But this time, the archaeological team had done proper excavation. removing centuries of ice and debris to reveal what had been hidden underneath. A steel door, smaller than the outer one, set flush with the rock, and in its center, preserved under a layer of ancient grease, was a combination dial. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead archaeologist, turned to Marcus. "Mr. Brennan, would you like to do the honors?" Marcus pulled out the journal, opened it to the marked page, and read aloud, 18, 7, 29, 4, 13. He approached the dial with hands that trembled slightly, despite his efforts to control them. Tyler stood beside him, one hand on his father's shoulder, support, solidarity, shared purpose. The cameras rolled, recording every moment. The room held its collective breath. Marcus began to turn the dial with deliberate care. Right to 18, left to 7, right to 29, left to 4, right to 13. For a moment, nothing. Marcus's heart sank. Then a click, deep and final, like a lock that had been waiting a century to finally open. "It's open," someone whispered. The words barely audible. Marcus grasped the handle and pulled. The door swung smoothly on hinges that, despite a century of waiting, had been built by craftsmen who understood that some things needed to last. Behind it was a chamber perhaps 10 feet square. And inside, "Oh my God," Dr. Chen breathed. The inner chamber held no mineral samples, no gems or precious metals. Instead, it was filled with something far more valuable: knowledge. Shelf after shelf of leather-bound journals, hand-drawn maps with notations in multiple languages, scientific instruments of exquisite craftsmanship, brass sextants, microscopes, measuring tools that were works of art, photographic plates in sealed containers, still viable after all these years. And most incredibly, a complete set of geological surveys documenting mineral deposits across the entire southern hemisphere. Each location marked with precision, each notation detailed with scientific rigor. This was the real treasure of the Talbot expedition, not the specimens themselves, but the knowledge of where millions more could be found. Maps that could guide future exploration. Data that could rewrite understanding of southern hemisphere geology. Information that, in the wrong hands, could lead to exploitation and destruction, but in the right hands, could advance science and protect vulnerable territories. And on a brass plaque, mounted on the back wall, a final message in Captain Talbot's own handwriting: "To whoever finds this. These maps and journals represent 3 years of our lives and the contributions of 47 men, most of whom did not survive to see home again. We hid this knowledge not from greed, but from fear that it would be used wrongly, that nations would fight over these resources, that the pursuit of wealth would destroy the very places we worked so hard to document. If you've found this chamber, you've demonstrated patience, persistence, and respect for what we built. We trust you to use this knowledge wisely, not to extract every mineral, but to understand what lies beneath the ice. Not to claim territory, but to expand human knowledge. These maps are our legacy. Make it mean something. Make it." Captain Robert Talbot. The 19th of March, 1913. The room was silent as Dr. Chen photographed the plaque with reverent care. Tyler squeezed Marcus's shoulder. Carmen wiped at her eyes. And Marcus felt something break loose in his chest, not grief, not triumph, but a profound sense of rightness. He'd been chosen by history, by fate, by whatever forces guide fools and salvage operators to the treasures they're meant to find. We'll catalog every page, Dr. Chen was saying, her voice thick with emotion. These surveys could revolutionize our understanding of Antarctic geology, help us predict climate change impacts, guide conservation efforts for decades to come. But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. He was reading Talbot's words again, thinking about 47 men who'd sailed into the unknown, believing they were chasing profit, but who'd ultimately created something far more valuable. A trust that stretched across centuries, a belief that knowledge mattered more than gold, and a faith that the right person would eventually find what they'd left behind. "You okay?" Tyler asked quietly. Marcus looked at his son and smiled, really smiled for the first time in what felt like years. "Yeah, kid. I think I finally am. Because standing in that chamber, surrounded by century-old journals and maps that could change the world, Marcus understood what he'd been searching for all along. It wasn't treasure or adventure or validation. It was purpose, a way to matter, a legacy worth protecting. And now, by some miracle he didn't fully understand, he'd found it in the last place anyone thought to look. A frozen graveyard at the bottom of the world, where 47 men had left behind not just specimens, but a story worth finishing. The documents would be digitized, studied, shared with researchers worldwide. The specimens would be displayed in museums. The Trust would fund Antarctic research for generations. And the Talbot expedition, forgotten for a century, would finally serve the purpose its captain had intended. Marcus thought about that first day, standing in an auction house while people laughed at his frozen graveyard purchase. He thought about cutting open that sealed door, about finding treasure beyond imagination, about fighting to protect it, and ultimately learning to share it properly. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones you keep, he realized. Sometimes they're the ones you give away. The announcement that the inner chamber contained not just mineral samples but comprehensive geological surveys sent shockwaves through the scientific community, like seismic waves rippling across the globe. Within days, Marcus found himself fielding calls from National Geographic, the Smithsonian Institution, Oxford University, and a dozen other prestigious organizations. The documentary crew's preliminary footage went viral, racking up over 50 million views in the first week alone, with comments flooding in from every corner of the world. But Marcus wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in doing right by Captain Talbot's legacy, in honoring the sacrifice of 47 men who died believing their work mattered. The Brennan Talbot Trust was established 6 months after the inner chamber's opening. The formal ceremony took place not in some grand hall filled with dignitaries, but at the restored whaling station itself, under the endless Antarctic sky where it all began. Representatives from 8 nations attended, along with scientists whose research would be transformed by the discovery, historians who'd spent careers studying polar exploration, and the descendants of the original Talbot expedition crew, people who'd grown up with family stories about ancestors who'd sailed south and never returned. Edmund Pierce was there, looking considerably humbler than at their first contentious meeting, his expensive suit somehow seeming less impressive against the vast white landscape. Even Raymond had made the journey, grumbling about the cold but unable to hide the pride that softened his weathered features. Marcus stood at a podium set up near the sealed building, now transformed into a climate-controlled archive and research station. Tyler stood beside him, and to Marcus's surprise, Jennifer had come too, claiming she wanted to see what all the fuss was about. But the way she looked at the restored buildings, at the international team of researchers moving purposefully between structures, suggested something more like respect for what Marcus had accomplished. Captain Talbot and his crew didn't die chasing treasure, Marcus began, his voice carrying across the ice with surprising clarity in the still Antarctic air. They died trying to expand human knowledge about a continent we still barely understand. They hid their findings not because they wanted to keep them secret, but because they wanted them found by someone who would value knowledge over profit. He paused, looking out at the assembled faces, scientists with journals under their arms, government officials in expensive cold weather gear, camera crews recording every word, descendants clutching photographs of men who'd never come home. I'm just a salvage operator from Alaska. I bought this place because my grandfather told me stories about whaling stations being more than they seemed. I had no idea I was stepping into a trust that had been waiting 100 years for someone to claim it. But now that I have, I want to honor what Talbot intended. Tyler handed him a leather folder embossed with the Foundation's seal, a whale breaching beneath the Southern Cross constellation. Marcus opened it to reveal the trust documents, printed on heavy paper that gave weight to the promises they contained. The Brennan Talbot Trust is endowed with the proceeds from the mineral specimens found in the outer vault. Preliminary valuations put that endowment at approximately $240 million. A murmur ran through the crowd, the number somehow more real when spoken aloud in this place where it had been hidden for so long. Those funds will be used for 3 purposes: Antarctic research and conservation, preservation of historic Antarctic sites, and educational programs that teach young people about exploration, sacrifice, and the value of knowledge over greed. The geological surveys from the inner chamber will be digitized and made available to researchers worldwide, free of charge. They'll be the foundation of an Antarctic geological database that can help us understand climate change, predict environmental shifts, and guide conservation efforts for generations to come. And this facility, the whaling station that everyone called a frozen graveyard, will become the Talbot Research Station, a place where scientists can study, students can learn, and history can be preserved not as a dusty relic, but as a living reminder of what human courage and sacrifice can achieve. The applause that followed was genuine, warm, echoing off the ice and metal in a way that sounded almost like music. But what moved Marcus most was the sight of Tyler's face, pride mixed with understanding, the expression of a young man who finally saw not just what his father had found, but why it mattered. After the ceremony, a woman in her 70s approached with careful steps on the ice. She had Talbot's eyes, blue-gray and sharp, and carried herself with the same quiet confidence Marcus had read about in the captain's journals. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Elizabeth Talbot Morrison. Robert Talbot was my great-grandfather." Marcus felt something catch in his throat, emotion welling up unexpectedly. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm honored. Your great-grandfather was a remarkable man. He was also stubborn, reckless, and terrible at taking advice." She smiled, the expression transforming her face. "My grandmother used to say he'd have gotten along famously with anyone foolish enough to buy an abandoned whaling station at auction." They both laughed, and Elizabeth pulled out an old photograph from inside her coat. It showed a young Talbot standing in front of the Endurance, his hand resting on the ship's railing, his expression carrying the weight of someone who knew the journey ahead was dangerous but necessary. This was taken the day before they sailed from Grytviken for the last time. Elizabeth said quietly, "He knew the journey was dangerous. My grandmother told me he wrote her a letter before he left, saying some things were worth dying for. Not money, not glory, but the idea that knowledge should outlast any individual life. He succeeded, Marcus said, his voice rough. The surveys in that inner chamber are going to transform Antarctic science. I know. That's why I'm here. Elizabeth reached into her bag and pulled out another journal, smaller than the expedition logs, bound in blue leather that had faded with age. This was Robert's personal diary. Not the official records, those were in the vault. This one he sent home with a returning crew member in 1912, before the final expedition south. It's been in our family ever since. She held it out to Marcus, the gesture carrying the weight of generations. I want it to be part of the research station's collection, so people can understand not just what he discovered, but who he was. The man behind the mission. Marcus took the diary with reverent hands, feeling the weight of history in the worn leather. Are you sure? This is your family's most personal connection to him. And now it's everyone's history, Elizabeth replied simply. That's what Robert would have wanted. His legacy wasn't meant to stay locked in our family stories. It was meant to inspire. The months that followed were a blur of activity that transformed the forgotten whaling station into something unprecedented. The trust needed to be properly structured. Its board of directors assembled from scientists, historians, and financial experts. Research projects needed to be vetted and funded. The station itself needed to be transformed from abandoned ruin to functioning facility, a process that required engineers who marveled at the original construction, archaeologists who carefully preserved every artifact, and educators who saw the site's potential for inspiring future generations. Marcus coordinated everything from a small office in Punta Arenas, but he spent increasing amounts of time at the station itself as it took shape. The processing plant was converted into laboratory space with equipment that would have astounded the original whalers. The residential quarters were restored and modernized, providing housing for researchers who came for weeks or months at a time. And where the old fuel depot had stood, a new structure rose: the Talbot Memorial Hall, a circular building with walls of reinforced glass looking out over the Antarctic landscape. Tyler became involved too, initially reluctantly, claiming he was just helping out during summer break. But Marcus watched his son's reluctance transform into genuine passion. Tyler helped design the education wing, focusing on making the station's history accessible to young people. His idea, a virtual reality experience that let visitors join the Talbot expedition, became the museum's most popular attraction, winning awards for innovative historical interpretation. "You're good at this," Marcus told him one evening as they reviewed architectural plans in the station's newly completed common room. The space was warm and bright, a stark contrast to the frozen landscape outside. At what? Playing with computers? Tyler didn't look up from his tablet. At understanding what matters. At seeing how to connect history to people who didn't live it. Marcus set down the plans he'd been studying. "You've got a gift, Tyler, for making the past relevant to the present." Tyler looked uncomfortable with the praise but also pleased, a flush coloring his cheeks. Those journals, Dad. Reading about those men, what they went through, it made me realize we're all part of something bigger. Like, what we do now becomes history for someone else later. That's kind of profound when you think about it. Yeah, Marcus agreed quietly. It is. So what are you going to do? Tyler asked, finally meeting his father's eyes. After all this? You can't run a salvage operation and manage a research station. Marcus had been thinking about exactly that. Raymond had already made his thoughts clear during a crackling phone call weeks ago. You've outgrown Alaska, Marcus. You've outgrown small-time salvage. You found something that matters more than any sunken trawler ever could. Don't shrink back down to fit the old life. I think, Marcus said slowly, choosing his words with care, I'm going to focus on this. On the trust, the station, on making sure Talbot's legacy serves the purpose he intended. Raymond's talking about retiring anyway. He can take over the business, or we can sell it. Either way, I think my salvage days are done. Mom's going to think you've lost your mind. Your mom's been thinking that for years, Marcus said with a slight smile. But she respects commitment, even when she thinks the thing I'm committed to is crazy. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Jennifer appeared in the doorway. She'd been spending more time at the station than Marcus had expected, ostensibly to be near Tyler, but he suspected she was also curious about what he'd built, and maybe impressed despite herself. The Chilean Minister of Science is on the satellite phone, she said. Something about a new research proposal involving climate modeling. That's the fourth call today. Marcus sighed. Standing. Everyone wants funding now that the trust is established. That's what happens when you become responsible for $240 million, Jennifer pointed out. But her tone wasn't judgmental. It was almost proud. You're actually good at this, you know. The whole administrator thing. Who knew? Not me. That's for sure. Marcus headed toward the communications room. You, staying for dinner? I thought I might. Jennifer glanced at Tyler. Someone needs to make sure you two don't live entirely on freeze-dried rations and instant coffee. It was the closest they'd been to feeling like a family in years. And Marcus felt something warm unfold in his chest. The Talbot Research Station officially opened to the public 18 months after Marcus had first bought the property at that contentious auction. The dedication ceremony drew international attention, with live streams watched by millions around the world, comments flooding in from students, scientists, and people who'd never thought much about Antarctica, but found themselves captivated by this story of treasure and trust. The restored whaling station was almost unrecognizable from the rust-covered ruin Marcus had first explored. The buildings had been reinforced and weatherproofed while maintaining their historical character, their metal siding now painted in the original colors red and white that stood out brilliantly against the ice. The sealed vault had been transformed into a climate-controlled archive where the original specimens rested in specially designed cases, and where the old rendering plant had stood, the new Talbot Memorial Hall rose like a promise made in glass and steel. But the heart of the complex was the Memorial Hall itself, that circular room with walls of reinforced glass, looking out over the Antarctic landscape. In its center was a display case containing Captain Talbot's compass, his personal diary, and the original expedition flag, tattered but preserved. Surrounding it were interactive exhibits telling the story of early Antarctic exploration, the whaling industry that had sustained these remote outposts, and the remarkable collection that had waited a century to be found. Marcus stood in the Memorial Hall on opening day, watching as the first group of schoolchildren entered, students from Punta Arenas, whose eyes went wide with wonder as they looked at the artifacts and listened to their guide explain about the men who'd sailed into the unknown. One girl, maybe 10 years old, stopped in front of the display case containing the geological survey maps. She stared at them for a long moment, her small face serious, then turned to her teacher with a question that made Marcus's heart squeeze. Did they know what they were looking for, or did they just explore until they found it? The teacher smiled, recognizing the profundity in such a simple question. That's a good question, Sophia. What do you think? I think, the girl said thoughtfully, her brow furrowed with concentration. They knew there was something worth finding. They just didn't know exactly what it would be. That's what makes it an adventure. Marcus felt Tyler come up beside him, his son's presence solid and reassuring. Smart kid, Tyler observed quietly. Yeah. Marcus smiled, warmth spreading through his chest. She gets it. Gets what? That the search matters as much as the discovery. Marcus turned to look at his son, seeing not the angry teenager from the auction house, but a young man who'd found his own purpose. Talbot didn't find what he expected to find. Neither did I. But we both found what we needed to find. Tyler nodded slowly, understanding. And what was that? Purpose. Meaning. Something bigger than ourselves. Marcus gestured at the children filling the hall, their excitement palpable, their curiosity a living thing. And now they get to discover what that means to them. A year later, the Trust's first major grants were announced at a press conference that made international headlines. $10 million for Antarctic climate research that would use Talbot's original surveys as a baseline for measuring change. $5 million for preservation of historic polar exploration sites scattered across the continent. $15 million for educational programs connecting underserved schools with polar science. The remaining endowment would continue generating returns, ensuring funding for future projects that served Talbot's vision. The station itself had become a hub of legitimate scientific activity that exceeded Marcus's wildest hopes. Research teams from 20 countries had spent time there, studying everything from ice core samples to penguin migration patterns. The geological surveys from Talbot's inner chamber had already led to 3 significant discoveries about Antarctic mineral composition and provided crucial data for climate change models that governments were now using to inform policy. Marcus found himself in the unlikely role of trust administrator and station director. He'd hired staff to handle day-to-day operations, but he still spent several months a year at the Antarctic station, partly because someone needed to oversee things, but mostly because he'd fallen in love with the place, its harsh beauty, its unforgiving honesty, the way it stripped away everything except what truly mattered. He was there on a clear Antarctic summer day when a helicopter arrived, carrying an unexpected visitor. His grandfather's old friend, a retired whaler named Henrik Olsen. Henrik was 92, frail but sharp-eyed, making what he'd announced would be his last journey south before death claimed him. "Your grandfather told me you'd do something like this," Henrik said as Marcus showed him around the restored complex. They stood in the processing plant, now a museum space with informational displays about whaling history, presented with respect for the dangerous work and acknowledgement of its environmental impact. "He said you had the family gift for finding things others couldn't see." "He never told me about this place," Marcus said, walking slowly to match Henrik's careful pace. "About the expedition, the vault, any of it." "Because he didn't know," Henrik replied, his weathered hand gripping Marcus's arm for support. "None of us did. The combination to that inner chamber was known by maybe 3 people in the whole world, and they all took it to their graves." He paused, looking around with eyes that had seen this place in its working prime. "But your grandfather?" He understood that these old stations held secrets. He believed in the honor of whalers, that we took care of what was entrusted to us, even when the world forgot we existed. "The outer vault was maintained for 60 years after the whaling stopped," Marcus observed. "Someone kept checking on it, keeping it sealed. Station managers, mostly. It was tradition, passed down like a sacred duty. Henrik ran his hand along a restored railing, feeling the smooth paint. You checked the vault like you checked the weather station or the fuel supplies. You didn't question it. You just did it. He smiled faintly. But eventually, everyone who remembered why they were checking was gone, and the tradition died with them, until I came along. Until you came along, Henrik agreed, turning to face Marcus fully, and gave it all new meaning. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box, scarred with age. This was your grandfather's. He wanted you to have it, but I was supposed to wait until you'd found whatever you were meant to find. Marcus took the box with trembling hands and opened it. Inside was a compass, brass and glass, beautifully made, with an inscription on the back. The direction matters less than the courage to choose one. Captain R. Talbot to Henrik Olsen. 1959. Talbot gave this to my grandfather. Marcus's voice came out strangled. After the war, when some of us came back to work the stations, Henrik's eyes were distant with memory. Robert Talbot's brother survived and became a whaler. He gave a few of these out to men he trusted, men who understood what his brother had died trying to protect. Your grandfather was one of them. Marcus stared at the compass, feeling the weight of connection across generations. He knew, my grandfather knew about the expedition, about Talbot's intention. He knew something was worth protecting. He didn't know what, but he believed in protecting it anyway. Henrik placed his hand over Marcus's, over the compass. That's faith, son, real faith. And you proved it was justified. The next major milestone came 3 years after the station's opening. Tyler's graduation from university, with a degree in historical preservation and museum studies. He'd written his thesis on Antarctic exploration legacy sites, using the Talbot Research Station as his primary case study. The paper won awards, got published in academic journals, and more importantly, caught the attention of preservation societies around the world. The ceremony was in Seattle, a world away from Antarctic ice. Marcus, Jennifer, Raymond, and even Carmen Valdez attended. Tyler gave a speech about how his father's crazy investment had taught him that history wasn't dead, it was sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it up and show the world why it mattered. Afterward, at a small celebration dinner, Tyler made an announcement that shouldn't have surprised Marcus, but still made his throat tight. I've accepted a position at the station, Associate Director of Education and Outreach. Marcus set down his wine glass carefully. You're coming to work with me? If you'll have me. Tyler's expression was earnest, excited, touched with the vulnerability of someone offering something precious. Someone needs to keep expanding those educational programs, and I think I finally understand what you were searching for all those years. I want to help build it. Jennifer reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand, a gesture of support that would have been impossible years ago. He's right. You know, you didn't just find treasure. You created something that matters. And now, it's becoming a family legacy. The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of that realization settling over them all. Then Raymond raised his glass, his gruff voice thick with emotion, to Marcus, Brennan, who taught us that sometimes the biggest fools become the greatest visionaries. They drank to that, and Marcus felt something settle in his chest, not quite peace, but something close. Satisfaction, maybe. The bone-deep knowledge that the path he'd chosen, however crazy it had seemed, had been exactly right. 5 years after that initial auction, Marcus stood once again at the edge of the whaling station, watching the sun paint the ice in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossible, too beautiful for this harsh place. The station bustled with activity, now a small city of purpose and discovery. Researchers came and went on regular helicopter flights. School groups toured during the summer months. Documentary crews filmed regularly. In the distance, he could see new construction, an expanded laboratory wing funded by the Trust's latest grant cycle, designed to study the effects of climate change on Antarctic ecosystems. Tyler walked up beside him, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, steam rising into the cold air like offerings. Anton just radioed from the boat. "He's got that new diving equipment you ordered for the underwater archaeological survey." "Good. We're going to need it." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. The surveys showed there might be 3 more expedition wrecks in the surrounding waters. Each one could tell us more about early Antarctic exploration. "You ever regret it?" Tyler asked suddenly. "Spending everything on this place? Walking away from the salvage business? From the life you knew?" Marcus thought about it. Really thought about it. He thought about those first days when everyone laughed at him in the auction house, when Raymond called him crazy, when he stood alone in the ruins wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He thought about the threats, the legal battles, the moments of doubt that kept him awake at night, wondering if he was destroying his family for nothing. But he also thought about the research that had been conducted here, discoveries about Antarctic geology that were rewriting textbooks. He thought about the students who'd been inspired, the young scientists who'd found their calling. He thought about the trust that would continue funding polar science long after he was gone. He thought about Captain Talbot's legacy finally serving the purpose it was meant to serve. "No," he said simply. The word, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "This was exactly what I was supposed to find. What I was supposed to do." Tyler nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Good, because you're stuck with it now." He smiled. "And stuck with me. I've got about 50 new program proposals I want to run by you." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the Antarctic evening unfold in colors that defied description. Somewhere behind them, in the memorial hall, school children were learning about exploration and sacrifice. In the laboratories, scientists were unlocking secrets of the past to understand the future. And deep in the archives, Talbot's journals and maps waited for the next generation of readers to discover why knowledge matters more than gold. Marcus thought about that first day, standing in an auction house while people laughed at his frozen graveyard purchase. He thought about cutting open that sealed door, about finding treasure beyond his wildest imagination, about fighting to protect it, and ultimately learning that the greatest treasures are the ones you share, not the ones you hoard. "Your grandfather would be proud," Tyler said quietly, echoing Henrik's words from years ago. "Yeah." Feeling the weight of his own grandfather's compass in his pocket, the one Talbot's brother had given to a whaler who understood that some things were worth protecting, even when you didn't fully understand why. "I think he would be." The Antarctic wind picked up, carrying with it the ancient song of ice and stone, the sound of a continent that had outlasted empires and would outlast them all. Tomorrow, there would be more work, always more work. The station needed constant maintenance, the trust required careful administration, and the mission of honoring Talbot's legacy was never truly complete. But tonight, Marcus allowed himself a moment of profound satisfaction. He'd done what he set out to do, even if he hadn't known what that was when he started. He'd found something worth preserving, protected it when others tried to steal it, and transformed it into something that would outlive them all. "Come on," Marcus said, finishing his coffee. "Let's get inside. We've got those funding proposals to review, and Maria says there's a storm coming in tomorrow." "Always another storm in Antarctica," Tyler observed, falling into step beside his father. "Yeah," Marcus smiled. "But we're not going anywhere." And they weren't. Because some places, some missions, some legacies are worth staying for, worth fighting for. No matter how many storms try to drive you away. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant and infinite in the Antarctic darkness. The same stars that had guided Talbot's expedition a century ago. In his pocket, Marcus still carried 2 compasses now, his grandfather's, and a new one Tyler had given him on the station's opening day, inscribed with words that had become the Foundation's motto. "Knowledge preserved is humanity protected." Marcus had learned something important over these 5 years. Home wasn't always a place you left from. Sometimes it was a place you arrived at, a purpose you discovered, a legacy you chose to carry forward into an uncertain future. The whaling station lights glowed warm against the cold darkness, a beacon of human purpose in the vast emptiness. Somewhere in the memorial hall, a child was probably staring at Talbot's compass right now, wondering what it would be like to sail into the unknown, wondering if they, too, could find something worth the journey, something worth the sacrifice. Marcus hoped they would, because the world still held mysteries waiting to be uncovered, treasures waiting to be found, and stories waiting to be told by those brave enough to look where everyone else refused to go. He thought about all the people who'd doubted him, the salvage operators who'd laughed in the auction house, the townspeople who'd called him crazy, even Raymond who'd tried to talk him out of it. Where were they now? Still doing the same work, still living the same lives, still convinced that practical wisdom meant never taking risks. But Marcus had risked everything, and in return, he'd gained everything that mattered. The frozen graveyard had become a temple of knowledge. The laughingstock had become a visionary, and the $300 million secret had revealed itself to be something far more valuable than money, proof that courage, properly directed, could change the world. As they reached the station's entrance, Tyler paused and looked back at the ice fields stretching to the horizon. "You know what's crazy, Dad?" "What's that?" "A year from now, there'll be more research teams here, more students, more discoveries, and it all started because you refused to listen when everyone said you were wrong." Marcus put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes, the best decisions are the ones that make no sense to anyone but you." They stepped inside together, father and son, into the warmth and light of the station they'd built from ruins and faith. Behind them, the Antarctic night closed in, ancient and eternal. But inside, human purpose burned, bright, a small flame of knowledge and determination that would not be extinguished by cold, or time, or doubt. Because that's what Marcus Brennan had learned in his journey from laughingstock to legend. Treasures come in many forms. Some glitter with the fire of diamonds. Some carry the weight of gold. But the greatest treasures are measured not in dollars, but in lives changed, knowledge preserved, and legacies honored. And sometimes, just sometimes, all it takes is one person foolish enough to believe that what everyone else calls worthless might actually be priceless. Anyone can discover treasure if they're brave enough to look where everyone else refuses to go. As the Antarctic stars wheeled overhead, and the Talbot Research Station hummed with purpose and possibility, Marcus Brennan understood something profound. He hadn't just bought a forgotten whaling station. He'd claimed a piece of history and transformed it into a beacon for the future, a light that would guide generations yet unborn. The man they'd laughed at had become the guardian of a legacy that would inspire for centuries. The frozen graveyard had become a sanctuary of knowledge, and the $300 million secret had revealed itself to be something far more valuable than money. Proof that some things are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth everything. Because for Marcus, and for everyone who would follow in his footsteps, the greatest treasure wasn't what he found beneath the ice. It was what he chose to do with it, share it, protect it, use it to make the world better than he found it. That's the real legacy. That's what lasts. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories of courage, discovery, and transformation that will leave you inspired. Click to continue the journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some dreams are worth chasing to the ends of the earth.